Mark Massa, and I'm the director of the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life. So we are delighted that you're with us on this occasion. This is, of course, the inaugural Alan Wolf Lecture on Religion and American Politics. The lecture, as some of you know, is named in honor of Professor Alan Wolf, who served as the founding director of the Blasey Center here at Boston College from 1999 to 2016. As most of you do already know, Alan is a prominent, one could say preeminent, public intellectual as well as a distinguished academic, being the author of over 20 books, 3 of which were named by the New York Times as notable books of the year. He is a renowned scholar of public life himself, as well as of the sociology of religion, and Alan has had a large impact on the way that sociologists and political scientists understand religion in America, especially Protestant fundamentalism. Alan, would you stand up so we can all give you a round? I am honored and daunted to be filling such large shoes, so we're delighted that you're here. It is fitting, then, that we host this evening Candida Moss as the inaugural Wolf Lecture at the Blasey Center. Professor Moss's most recent book, Bible Nation, The United States of Hobby Lobby. I finished this this afternoon. You need to run out and buy this book. It's a great read. It's a hoot, as well as deeply insightful. It goes very fast. And I started reading it and discovered that I had read 50 pages, like without let's do a few pages. I noticed an hour later, I'm on page 50, so it's a great read. She has co-authored this book with Professor Baden at Yale Divinity School. And the book studies the ways in which fundamentalist and evangelical understandings of the Christian Bible influence American national identity and public culture. I just finished reading it, and I give it my highest 4-star review. For those of you who know me, know I don't give that review very often. It is about, among other things, the new Museum of the Bible, which is in Washington, D.C., just 2 blocks off the mall. A museum founded and funded by the Green family, who are the founders of the national chain of stores known as Hobby Lobby. Her approach of applying rigorous thinking to important public questions, especially questions about religion, echoes the style of Alan Wolf's own work and shares Alan's goal of bridging the gap between the academy and public life in American culture in a constructive and accessible way. Professor Moss has received her bachelor's degree from Oxford University and her PhD from Yale University. She taught in that other place in South Bend, Indiana, from 2008 to 2017, before being named the Canterbury Professor of Theology at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. She is the award-winning author and editor of 7 books and over 30 articles and essays. She has served as the papal news contributor to CBS News and has appeared in documentaries for CNN, NBC, and the National Geographic and History channels. She is also, so you do this in lieu of sleeping, right? She is also a columnist for the Daily Beast, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and Politico. We are thrilled that Dr. Moss is be able to join us this evening as our first Alan Wolf lecturer. Please join me in welcoming Candida Moss.
Thank you very much for that very kind welcome. I'd like to begin by thanking Eric Owens and the Blasey Center for inviting me here to speak to you today. It is an enormous honor to give the inaugural Wolf Lecture, and I hope that at the end of it, Alan Wolf will wonder if inviting me here was some kind of impersonal insult to him. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming. It's very wet and cold outside, and I realize you have other places to be. The one exception of anyone who's getting extra credit for being here, I'm not thanking you. My talk today can sound stands the Green family of Oklahoma City, better known to most of us as the owners of the crafting store Hobby Lobby. Hobby Lobby was founded in the 1960s by David Green. David Green started Hobby Lobby out of his garage, and he started with his two sons, Steve and Mart, being paid 6 cents a piece to put together photograph frames. It's a real American story. But David Green was also the offspring of Baptist ministers. Sorry, not Baptist ministers, Pentecostal ministers. And because of that, he felt inadequate. He said this in interviews. He felt that he had not given back in the way that his siblings, who also went into ministry, had done. And as a result, Hobby Lobby Incorporated, which is, as I'm sure all of you know, an S corporation, gives 50% of its profits to charitable causes every year. I realized how big Hobby Lobby was in the philanthropic world when a different Christian billionaire who gives money to charity told me that, oh no, he wasn't like the Greens, because the Greens were the premier philanthropic Christian family in America. What I'm going to talk to you about today is about the Green family, about their influence on religion and public life in America through various ventures, some of which you will likely have heard of, and some of which you may not. And I want to give a basic overview, not just of what they're doing, but why they're doing what they're doing, and what the message of those ventures are. There's a lot of time for questions, so if there are things that you're interested in and want to hear more about, hopefully we can talk about it during Q&A afterwards. Hobby Lobby, the company, was always founded to operate on what they call biblical principles. But you probably didn't know that until 2014, because that was when the Green family became embroiled in Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, the court case that went to the Supreme Court, and that to many people's surprise, they actually won. It was over contraception. You may recall pictures of the Green family coming down the steps in Washington, triumphant that they had won this lawsuit. And it was at that point that they really entered the public eye. People knew who they were. They had been giving away millions of dollars every year to philanthropic causes, but it was at that juncture that people knew this particular American family. After that point, in 2014, they became sort of religious icons in certain quarters. And they began to have influence not just for the amount of money that they were giving away, but also as kind of political commentators. So in the 2016 election, every single Republican candidate for president, with the exception of Donald Trump, made a kind of pilgrimage to Oklahoma City to meet with them in order to seek their endorsement. They actually endorsed Marco Rubio, which didn't go so great for them. But on September 1st, 2016, David Green, the founder of Hobby Lobby, wrote an op-ed in USA Today in which he argued that American Christians should vote for Donald Trump because of the Supreme Court issue. It was a very well-read op-ed and encapsulated part of the rationale that American evangelicals found for voting for Donald Trump, despite many things about him that jarred with their social sensibilities. Well, this was the moment that we all learned who they were. We learned who they were through that court case. They had actually been sort of somewhat quietly involved in philanthropy and political activism for about a decade before that. They had been supporting evangelical-based charities. If you want to get money from the Green family, you have to do a number of things. The first is go to Oklahoma City and sell them on your idea. You will also have to take a kind of religious litmus test. Nobody's exempt from this test. Rick Warren went and had to sort of go through the, well, tell me what you think about the virgin birth questions. I imagine everyone in this room could answer that question accurately. So what was interesting about their philanthropy at this stage was that they were exclusively investing in charitable organizations that were about spreading the word of God, either translating it, or putting it in people's hands, or teaching people to have access to the gospel without being able to read. David Green said in an interview with Forbes magazine that if people were to die without food, or without the word of God, that he would rather die without food. And that was why he didn't give money to hospitals. This really exemplifies the fact that they feel that they have a moral imperative to spread the gospel. This is important to know because when you think about everything Hobby Lobby has done, not just the support for evangelical-based charities, but also their holiday advertising. If you live in the Midwest, you may have been exposed to this. Hobby Lobby puts out advertisements. Advertisements? What do you say here? Advertisements? I'm bilingual English American, but sometimes I forget. Advertisements at Christmas and Easter and on July 4th about the role of God in our lives. I imagine this is enormously expensive for them, but it's one of the ways that they transmit their holiday message. They also have been covertly funding legislation. This is one of the things they prefer that you not know about. They've put a lot of money into funding legislation that protects traditional marriage, or so-called traditional marriage, depending on your perspective, in Arizona. The only reason we know about this is because of a Slate piece that exposed the tax filings of a couple of organizations. But that's one of the things they do. They put about $60 million in a single piece of legislation in Arizona. They also developed a Bible curriculum. So far, this has been the least successful of their ventures. Their Bible curriculum they wanted to put into public schools in Oklahoma and Texas. They were fought very hard by the ACLU and by various atheist advocacy groups about how they were trespassing across the church-state divide. And so, temporarily, they shelved their Bible curriculum. And finally, there's Museum of the Bible, which I'm going to spend most of my time on today. Museum of the Bible is a non-profit organization that includes the actual physical museum in Washington, D.C. that they built, but also a number of other projects that you might be interested to hear about. Now, when you think about why the Greens are doing any of this, why build a museum? Why fund legislation? They're doing it for a number of reasons. In the first place, because they believe, as many evangelicals do, that they have an imperative to spread the good news about Jesus. Anyone who's read the Bible knows why they think that. But they're also doing it because, in their opinion, the United States of America was founded as a Christian country on the morals encoded in the Bible. And they're trying to return the United States to that Christian origin. Their efforts, they would say, are not a deliberate effort to trespass against the boundary between church and state. They have a constitutional right, as any of us do, to advocate for their views about how the country should be run. We should also add that their beliefs, even though sometimes this has been sort of, people have cast aspersions on this, they authentically hold their beliefs. They are the real deal. It is not the case that they just didn't want to pay for contraception. All of their beliefs are very authentically held. But what we should note is that their actions are not consonant with their public persona. So when they fought their lawsuit, the Hobby Lobby Burwell lawsuit, the story they told about themselves was that they were a nice evangelical family in Oklahoma City who loved their country. All of that is true. And that they didn't want to sue the government, they had to sue the government because their religious beliefs were at stake. It was only at this juncture, and if you watch the videos of David Green, you'll see this, it was only at this juncture that they were kind of dragged into political activism. Beforehand, they didn't care. But that's simply not the case. Not only because of their political activism, but because of their holiday advertising. So their actions aren't consonant with their public persona. Long before the Affordable Care Act was like a glimmer in Obama's eye, They had been activists in the public sphere, and what this means is, if the Green family are to you, as they are to many, Christian heroes, they were always Christian heroes. If they are to you culture warriors, then that has always been the case. Whether or not they sought the spotlight, they actually always desired to convert a nation. And what this points out for us is that there's a difference between their public messaging and their personal goals. And that's important to note because of their museum. So I want to focus on Museum of the Bible, the thing about which you probably have heard the most. Museum of the Bible is made up of a number of things. First, a collection. A collection originally acquired by the Green family. The way that the collection was built was that they would hire scholars to find texts. Those scholars could not just purchase the texts willy-nilly. They had to ask the Green family for permission. The family would meet and decide whether or not they would purchase something, and then it would be bought. Those items were then donated to Museum of the Bible, which has a sort of own separate collection. Then there's a Scholars Initiative. The Scholars Initiative is made up of many scholars, many of them New Testament scholars, but also Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, historians, especially Americanist historians. They are all in the employ of Hobby Lobby Incorporated. That has changed recently, but people used to get checks that came from Hobby Lobby when they won prizes. The Scholars Initiative, which was originally called the Green Scholars Initiative, was founded, Steve Green told us, in order that they might find out what they had. So they had acquired all of these artifacts, and they couldn't read them because they were in Greek. And they needed someone to translate them. So hiring these scholars to work on these texts did a number of things. It told them what they had, and they could write their placards for their museum, but it also elevated the value of those artifacts. When scholars work on artifacts, identify them, date them, talk about their cultural and historical significance, the value of those artifacts goes up. The scholars who signed up to work for the Scholars Initiative signed non-disclosure agreements. Those non-disclosure agreements, certainly the ones that have been put together more recently, cover your social media use. You are not allowed to disparage Museum of the Bible or the Green family on social media. Now this may not seem that strange. I mean, lots of people sign non-disclosure agreements, but those people normally work for sort of big pharmaceutical companies. And scholars generally like to share ideas. So this has had a tremendously pronounced effect on the sort of theological academic community. Because what does it mean when you have a cluster of people who have access to texts that no one else has access to, and they can't talk about it? They also have something called Covenant Journey. Covenant Journey is Birthright, if you know what that is. It's the free trips for Jewish teenagers in early 20s to go to Israel and learn about their heritage, except Covenant Journey, which is co-run with Liberty Counsel. It's a legal firm that has defended several high-profile cases of people making sort of religious objections to various political moves. Covenant Journey will take you to Israel to learn about Christianity. They had touring exhibits. A lot of their early collaborations were with Ken Ham's Noah's Ark Museum and his Creationist Museum. They left a lot of artifacts there. And they have now incorporated into Museum of the Bible their Bible curriculum, which is currently being used in homeschooling in the US, in Israel, only the first half, obviously, and actually in some private schools in the United Kingdom. Then there's the museum. The museum, I think some of you have pictures of it. The museum is huge. There are like 10. So when I say some of you, I mean the small fragment, like the elite that are going to heaven. And the Museum of the Bible is huge. It's easily the world's largest Bible museum. It's in DC, and you can go to the top, you can see the dome of the Capitol building, you can see the Washington Monument. It is positioned, and deliberately positioned, to be the sort of Christian Smithsonian. The whole idea for this museum began with a collection. A man named Scott Carroll sold the Greens on the idea that their charitable model would work for ancient artifacts. Their charitable model is that if they're going to purchase something to donate it to charity, the thing they're purchasing must be worth 3 times as much as they're purchasing it for. And Scott Carroll convinced the Green family that with manuscripts, you could get an even bigger return. And we can talk about this more in Q&A if you want, but there are certain kinds of artifacts, Jewish artifacts in particular, that have been very financially rewarding for Museum of the Bible. They started collecting in November 2009. No one was collecting artifacts in 2009 because there had been a global market crash the year before. So it was a buyer's market, and they were the only people shopping. They ended up acquiring 40,000 artifacts, the majority of which were purchased between 2010 and 2014. They struck up partnerships with prestigious institutions like Vatican, Oxford, Cambridge, Jewish Theological Seminary. And all of the artifacts that they themselves acquired, they acquired with the intent of donating those to the museum. A museum that they themselves don't have a lot of artistic control over. The approximate value of the museum is about $1 billion. Not everything on display there actually belongs to the Greens or Museum of the Bible. A lot of it is actually just facsimiles, that's copies. It's a little disheartening to go to the Vatican exhibit and see that they just have copies of everything. But if you go look at their tax filings, you can find out exactly what was donated. When the museum was founded, it was founded according to their 2010 tax filings as a non-profit. They have to disclose this. It was founded, and I quote, to bring to life the living word of God, to tell its compelling story of preservation, and to inspire confidence in the absolute authority and reliability of the Bible. A very clearly stated evangelical goal. That's not the story they tell about themselves now. They will tell you that it is a non-sectarian museum. In 2012, they changed their tax filing so that it now read, we exist to invite people to engage with the Bible through our 4 primary activities: traveling exhibits, scholarship, building a permanent museum, and developing elective high school curriculum. That's what they say they do now. So one of the big questions for us in writing this book, and one of the big questions anyone should ask is this a museum that intends to educate America about what the Bible is and about the history of the Bible? Is it truly non-sectarian, or does it still have the same evangelical Protestant goals that it had at the beginning? Before I get to that question, I want to briefly talk about the antiquities. Because if they have received bad publicity for something, it has been for trafficking in illicit antiquities. And certainly this is something we can get into in depth later. The reason this was exposed was because of a seizure in 2011 of about 10,000 cuneiform tiles and bullae that had come from Iraq originally. The Green family had been warned that it was likely that these were illicit. Everything about the sale was shaky. They were imported into this country via FedEx, and the FedEx labels read, handcrafted clay tiles, which is not wrong. But a value of $300, on the other hand, is wrong. So they have been imported as samples for Hobby Lobby. When fact, they were reporting these not priceless, but considerably more valuable ancient artifacts. The reason that had happened was because they didn't have what's called provenance. If you want to import something to this country, you need a chain of legal ownership that stretches back to before 1917. The reason for that is all of the looting that takes place in any country that has valuable antiquities. You might think the Middle East, but this does happen in Italy. Because you have an archaeological dig that has like a really great sculpture in it, don't you want that? News of the investigation was actually first broken by myself about 2 years ago in some articles we wrote. But people really knew about it last July when the federal complaint was made public. They had to return all of the clay tablets, and it was reported widely in the media that they had to pay a $3 million fine. And if you take nothing else away from this talk, let me tell you this. It wasn't a fine. It was a civil forfeiture. And the reason why that matters is because they paid that money in lieu of other objects they had not in their possession that were similarly illicit. That means in addition to what they turned over, there was another $3 million worth of artifacts that they didn't get to hand over to the government because they had given them to someone else. And I don't personally know of anyone to whom they have donated other than Museum of the Bible. Point being, there's probably a little bit more to say about that. The big question is why all of these biblical artifacts at all? How many biblical artifacts do you need to tell the story of the Bible? How many Torah scrolls do you need? You know, copies of the first 5 books of the Bible. How many do you need? Like 1? Let's say 10. How about 3,000? 3,000 Torah scrolls. It's an interesting question. They have 3,000. I'm sure there's more that I can tell you about that in Q&A, but for now let me tell you what they say is the reason that they have Torah scrolls and Dead Sea Scrolls. Here are some quotes from Steve Green, who we interviewed a couple of years ago, in which he emphasizes that the point of having these scrolls is to demonstrate the absolute accuracy of the Bible. You want to say that there is a telephone game, and it, that's the Bible, was passed down and it changed over time. You're free to believe that, but let me show you the evidence. God gave those people, that's the Jews, a job, and they did that job well. They took it seriously, and they do to this day take it seriously. We have a debt of gratitude to the Jewish people because they provided us with the Hebrew text, and they did it well. Speaking more specifically about the Dead Sea Scrolls, he says this: it's an incredible story to be told that really dispels a lot of the critics. Let's look at it honestly. There's some variations. We don't want to say there's not. There is, but let's focus. Let's spend 90% of our time on the 90% of the scrolls that are consistent with modern Bibles and realize that's incredible. God, I think, protected the Dead Sea Scrolls for when he was ready for them to be revealed, and I just wonder what he still got buried under the ground and waiting for the right time for it to be revealed. Every time I read that line about God protecting the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think of these like parasite-ridden scrolls, and you think, well, not that well protected. I know there's a Dead Sea Scrolls scholar in the room who will know better than I do that in fact it isn't true that 90% of the scrolls are consistent with 90% of our modern Bibles. But it's clear what the Green family are trying to do. They're trying to say that because Jewish scribes, in copying out their Torah scrolls, did it so well, because the Jews could accurately transmit the Bible without alteration or error, that means that the whole Christian Bible is without variation. Now, any of you who have taken New Testament, you know, all of the problems with the textual history of the New Testament, well, what's interesting is how Judaism and the practices of Jews are being used as evidence for Christianity. It's a kind of soft supersessionism that's kind of leveraging Judaism to make claims about the Christian Bible. what they say about their museum is that they're not collectors, they're storytellers. The language the museum uses is that they just tell the facts, they're just presenting the Bible, and they're just telling the story. It's a problem to anyone who studies the Bible to talk about just the Bible. It's supposed to be a non-sectarian museum for Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. But Jews, Catholics, and Protestants don't even agree on which books are in the Bible. To say nothing of the story. The story is really difficult to tell. Any Bible scholar will tell you just telling the biblical story is impossible once you've read it. There's a certain naivete to just the whole way the museum sets itself up. The museum is organized into 3 primary floors. And I sadly don't have slides to show you how it's set up. But when you arrive at the museum, you've got this beautiful staircase. You see a lovely modern stained glass depiction of Jesus, and then you turn to what's called the impact floor. The impact floor is predominantly about the history of the Bible in America. Beginning with the Mayflower, you hear the story of faithful Christians escaping persecution by coming to America. You learn, in a very limited way, about the history of slavery, women's rights, social conscience, and attacks on various Christian groups in America. You then go through to sort of a more general impact section about how important the Bible was for science and medicine and civic engagement and all of these things in which, to be truthful, the Bible was really impactful in. Once you're done with that, you go to another floor, and that's where the Bible story is. And you can find 2 videos. They're animated. One of the Old Testament and one of the New Testament. The Old Testament one, it's sort of like a walk-through experience. So you get to walk through and see a burning bush. But the story is animated. It's about 30 minutes long. The New Testament story is 12 minutes long. Now, I'm sure you will realize you cannot possibly tell the story of the Hebrew Bible in 30 minutes, or the story of the New Testament in 12. And this is where the ideological commitments of the museum really start to come out. It's not really about what's in the museum, it's about what's not in the museum. We call this in our book, Ideology Through Omission. The same problem is inherent in the Bible curriculum. So, for example, and seeing as I'm at Boston College, what does it mean to present, in true biblical terms, Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles and Peter as the apostle to the Jews? It's not wrong. This is certainly how Paul would have it. But you are deliberately omitting a passage in the Gospel of Matthew in which Peter is given somewhat more elevated authority than that. And you will not learn about that here. It's not that it's anti-Catholic, it's just very Protestant. And this is the ways in which you can start to see the commitments come out. Finally, once you get through the 2 animated videos and you go through a sort of a recreation of Nazareth village, which is supposed to be like the town Jesus lived in, it's a little hokey, I have to say. You then can get to the history floor, where you will be inundated with beautiful manuscripts. The purpose of these manuscripts is to demonstrate to you that God's word has been protected and transmitted accurately from the very beginnings all the way to today. The actual history portion, it begins with sort of cuneiform tablets in order to demonstrate that in the time of Abraham there was writing. And if there was writing, one might infer that maybe the stories of Abraham were written down by eyewitnesses. Then we have a whole section of archaeological data that is seen to line up with events in the Bible, and then we have all of these texts. The history actually ends, though, with the Reformation. After the Reformation, after the Protestant Reformers, after the discussions about translation into the vernacular, we then just have translations. We have some missionary Bibles that are presented without any commentary about what might be problematic about missionary excursions into other parts of the world. What's interesting is what's not there. There's no reference for a museum so focused on America, on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And you're reading that it's a museum of the Bible. Should you mention the very large denomination that thinks there's a whole other section to the Bible? Probably. Should come up. Islam. Islam is now, there's a single plaque, they put it up since we first started criticizing them for this, and it's actually on the back of a pillar. There's like no artifact there, there's nothing, it's just like a small thing, like Islam sometimes mentions things that are in the Bible. There's a lot of biblical and extra-canonical material in the Quran that they don't talk about. And you would think surely that should be part of a museum of the Bible. Other things that do not somehow manage not to make it into the museum. I have no idea, having finished the museum, who wrote the books in it, when those books were written. I know nothing about textual variants. I would have no sense that translation might be an issue when it comes to understanding the meaning of these texts. It's almost as if the Bible hovers above language in the semiotic realm. The huge question then is, what's the museum really about? When you finish the impact floor, when you're done learning about America, you take a poll. The poll is about persecution of Christians in America. And do you think that Christians should have the freedom to read the Bible in America? The poll is then broken down. I think some of you have pictures of that one poll. One of the threads throughout Museum of the Bible is that that America was founded as a Christian country, and yet the Bible is under attack here, and it needs to be placed back in its central position at the center point of Christianity. It's a very problematic thread to have, given that there's no discussion of persecution of Christians anywhere else in the world. Where Christianity is primarily under threat is here in America, apparently. You might wonder, if you're telling the history of the Bible in America, what are you going to do about slavery? Some of you may have the picture of the slide about slavery. And what's interesting about the placard and the slavery section is they do know the Bible was used in support of slavery by the pro-slavery movement. If you read Mark Knowles' work, you'll know that when it comes to just using biblical proof texts in the slavery debate, that the pro-slavery group had it. There are more texts supporting slavery than there are texts condemning it. There just are. So they present those. And then they have an interesting concluding slide. The heading for the slide is religious freedom. Then they talk about how after the renewal and the revival of evangelicalism in the 1790s, that religious energy led to social change and the abolition of slavery. Some people in the South, and this is a quote, interpreted the Bible as being pro-slavery. So on the one hand, they're acknowledging the role of the Bible in both the pro-slavery movement and the abolitionist movement, both of which is factually correct. But the way they're describing those roles is different. Where the Bible is on the right side of history, that was just the Bible speaking, religious revival doing its job and being responsible for everything good that we have come to love about this country. Where the Bible stands on the wrong side of history, that was people interpreting it. It wasn't the Bible's fault that people interpreted the Bible to think it was pro-slavery. This is methodologically inconsistent. You can't occasionally say that the Bible speaks unencumbered in this powerful way that calls people to it, and then other times say that it is so vulnerable to misuse that it is utterly impotent. But this is precisely what Museum of the Bible will tell you when it comes to problematic events in which the Bible has been explicitly used. We asked Steve Green, why did you build the museum here? What is the purpose of the museum? And he said this: I think our legislators ought to know the foundations of our government. They ought to know that that's what their role is. And they need to know that this book speaks to life and it has advice. It advises how a good government should be. A government's role is to reward good and to punish evil at a high level. Our founding fathers unabashedly looked to the Bible in founding the nation, so why wouldn't it be right for our legislators to know our history of our government? So you'll notice what he thinks is that the Bible is a good resource for a description of how government should be run, for the role of our government. I don't think he's read every text about monarchy in the Hebrew Bible. My takeaway from the Deuteronomistic history was different. Bless you. Now this shouldn't surprise people. That they want to they want to influence politics, that they want to make America a Christian country again, shouldn't have surprised anybody. Those of you who read that blue, I can't believe I'm distributing that advertising, the blue stars and stripes poster, that is a holiday poster that they distribute July 4th throughout America. They've been distributing it since 2006, and on it are a number of US Supreme Court rulings, statements by the founders of Harvard and Yale about how this should be we should teach the Bible in order to have people be moral, and some quotes by sort of de Tocqueville and others, including quotes such as this one from Vidal and Girard, executed in 1844, which reads that the Bible should be taught as a divine revelation. Or this one from 1892, which reads that the United States is a Christian country. You can't read that poster as anything other than a critique of the current religio-political climate. Now, while they believe in religious tolerance for everyone, tolerance of other people's religious beliefs, they believe that religious tolerance is the magnanimous gift of a Christian God. The principle of religious freedom, Steve Green told us, comes from the Bible. Religious freedom looks different when it's the gift of the Christian deity than when it's a basic human right. And where this starts to fracture is in statements like this one from Steve Green. I'm going to read it slowly. Wars are created because of a conflict of worldviews. If you want to embrace a secular worldview, well, let's look at other secular worldviews and see what that has created. It's created the greatest tragedies in the world. The atheistic, communistic worldview has been the most destructive. In essence, that's what they're here refers to people who fought their Bible curriculum being put into public schools. What they're proposing is one without religion, in essence, an atheistic, communistic worldview. Now, looking beyond the kind of conflation of Christianity and atheism with capitalism and communism, and the equation of communism and secularization is sort of identical here, what we start to see is that religious freedom doesn't actually extend to those who have none at all. At that juncture, we find ourselves in the midst of sort of a kind of apocalyptic battle between good and evil, between those for the Bible and those against it. And we are very much back in the culture wars. Now, there's no doubting that the Green family means really well. They're incredibly nice people. At one point, I thought about throwing in this whole book project just to go to brunch with Lauren Green. They are sincere Christians. They do want to make the world a better place, and they have been very poorly advised at times, and they have hired individuals who are ill-equipped and unqualified to do the kind of work that was required of them. It's also very difficult to maintain intellectual standards when the unofficial hiring criteria are predominantly religious. We can try, and certainly I've tried to do this in the book that I wrote about them, to understand from where the arguments originate and to empathize with their motivations. If you think that there's a struggle between good and evil in the world, naturally, you need to fight those that you think are opposing good. But ultimately, those caveats are inadequate, because those whose ambitions extend to shaping the values of a nation have higher standards to meet. In the context of public education, unchecked confidence looks a great deal like hubris. The Greens are free to use their considerable wealth to exert influence over politics and legislation. They're welcome to run their company according to biblical principles. And they're at liberty to try and evangelize. This is America. But when they, however unwittingly, disguise evangelization as education and fortify their beliefs as some kind of religio-academic consensus, they're doing something more than merely misleading the public. When it comes to educating our children, informing our citizens, and serving as a resource to politicians about the very nature of government itself, there must be room for conversation and an insistence on historical accuracy. And at a certain juncture, after sort of multiple false starts, vocal public and academic objections, and several public relations makeovers, their naivete on these points starts to look willful. It is of this that the Greens are most guilty, and it is important because they are the most powerful religious group in America right now. And because of that, it matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moss. I think would you like to field these yourself?
Sure.
I'll give you this.
So, address your questions if you have questions to Dr. Moss. I know there's a couple of renowned Bible scholars in our midst, but
I'll just make a quick observation. I got to go before the museum opened, and it's unbelievable. But there's also things going on. There are things going on in terms of adjacencies. So at the introduction to the 1960s and civil rights, there's a big placard that talks about the civil rights movement, and there's a huge painting of someone behind it, which in your head you think is going to be Martin Luther King, but it's actually Billy Graham. And so there's a lot of stuff like that going on.
Yeah, there is. There's a lot of that. And I wish I could just spend 5 hours with you with all of the pictures I have of the museum, and we can talk about them and about what's peculiar and strange about the way that they present their history. There's a lot of that. One of the questions on the sort of, I mean, it's technologically advanced, but okay, it's inaccurate, but it's technologically advanced. One of the questions in the polling is, should Thomas Jefferson have been cutting up his Bible? And when you put it like that, it's sort of like, well, I guess not. But there's no real explanation as to why he's doing that. And I don't know what you thought, but my impression was just how unexplained so many things were. It's like, here's a bunch of books. Like, it's a good thing I know what they are. I can read them because it's not explained to me why they're significant or important. It's almost like they're just overwhelming you with old books of the Bible as proof that it's true.
Thank you for your presentation. It's really interesting. One of the things about the whole discussion of the Museum of the Bible and the Green family is the way that religion in America today has this sort of, is a commodity. that the material objects associated with religion could bring in such amounts of money. I remember being at a conference last summer, and there was some discussion of the Shoyin collection of Dead Sea Scrolls and how much money these fragments, they had absolutely nothing interesting on them, how much they actually brought on the black market. And I wondered, you know, sometimes we do this when we go to Costco on the weekend. We ask the person at the register, what is the biggest amount that you've rung up today, you know, just at Costco, just to get a sense of, like, what is the scale of these texts, you know, texts that, for example, like the scrolls, or, you know, I mean, could you just say a little bit more? Because I think these are the texts that, and especially the ones purchased by the Green family, that I think command such mystique and prestige, but yet are forgeries at the same time, you know. So I wonder if you could just comment on the amount, but also the authentication.
Yeah, so they're Dead Sea Scrolls, they published them already, and then a large number of scholars said, I think these are maybe all forged, if not 50%. And they have put on the scrolls that they have on display, they put, well, some scholars say that they're not authentic, but other scholars, and that's a common rhetorical technique they use when a scholarly consensus is against them. Some scholars say, but others say. So far as the Dead Sea Scrolls go, there's such a market. The reason why we see so many forged Dead Sea Scrolls with passages from Leviticus about homosexuality on them is because there's an evangelical market for those. And it's fascinating to me when I first started looking at this as a Roman Catholic, the way they felt about these texts. And so, I was like, don't you think that this is us being superstitious? When people get excited about objects, it almost seems like relics, the way they talk about them. But there's actually a storied history of that. So the American Bible Society, which went around trying to put unfettered access to the Bible in people's hands. They wanted everyone to have a copy of the Bible without emendation of commentary. You know, the kinds of things Catholics put in their Bibles. Didn't want you to have those. And there are some stories associated with the American Bible Society in which someone will throw out their copy of the KJV because they didn't want it and someone just brought it to their house. But then they'll kind of be called to it. It will draw them to it in this sort of almost superstition. It's the power of the word. A number of times people associated with the Museum of the Bible would talk about what it would mean for people to touch them, because coming into contact with the Word of God would be especially powerful. They actually have TV commercials at which once you come near the Bible, the character in the story, her eyes grow really wide. And if you know she's been hit by the Holy Spirit. But whatever happened, she got impacted by just coming into contact with the text itself. So the materiality is really important with the scrolls. The scrolls get fetishized in a certain way as sort of proof of the authenticity of the scriptures. We all know that with the exception of the Isaiah scroll, the thing that Steve Green said about the scrolls as evidence for the protection of the text is just simply wrong. There are plenty of textual variants, but they're fetishized in a certain way as a resource for ancient untapped texts, and the whole mystery associated with uncovering these forbidden fragments that have not been touched by other people, especially the church, capital C. There's a mystery and authenticity and purity in that rhetoric that surrounds them, which is one of the reasons you then end up with so many forged Dead Sea Scrolls texts at SMU, in the Green Family Collection, because not only are they all sort of biblical texts that seem to be theologically significant to those groups, but they want to have them. They believe in the materiality. Early on in the museum's planning, they have all of these Torah scrolls. Too many Torah scrolls, really. And they were going to put some of them in an educational display in the basement, and people were going to come and touch them. Like, unroll them. I see some people looking like a little horrified, and I'm not horrified from just a curatorial perspective. They're going to be destroyed if people come and touch them. But if we were at an Orthodox Jewish seminary, the outrage would be palpable, because you do not touch those scrolls with your fingers. So there is a sense of materiality that I'm rambling on about. Professor Gillett.
Thank you very much, Professor Moss.
Thank you for a very informative and fascinating glimpse of American Bible culture at this moment. I wonder if, to what degree is the Museum of the Bible sustainable? It's monumental in scale, and they possess so many artifacts that it seems like the potential there for scholarly research should be high. But there are also so many barriers to using those artifacts by other institutions that I wonder, is this an institution that's going to be around for a long time? You know, validated by other research institutions and making its resources available to scholars who are doing, you know, work like we do.
Well, one of the things that Museum of the Bible did so well was acquire very cheaply the reputation of other scholars and institutions. So for example, if you go to Cambridge and you say, we're going to buy this artifact, you can now have it and host it there. We own it, you can host it at Cambridge. We'll pay for your little conference. I mean, why would you say no? I have a lot of friends who have been involved along the way. I had a friend who was teaching at Oxford, and I saw he'd been on a panel. What are you doing on a panel organised by the Museum of the Bible at Oxford? He said, well, they offered us £250 to come down and sit on this panel and just talk. We didn't have to prepare anything. And those of you who aren't professional academics studying the Bible yet, that's, you know, kind of a lot of money to a Bible scholar. So for like 20 minutes of chattering about the thing that you chatter about for free most of the time. So obviously I go do that. It's not like you endorse them, surely. Except then they use your name. So when they've been accused of not being sensitive to Judaism or to Roman Catholicism, I thought, how could that be possible? The Vatican's involved. We did this display, Oxford. Look at the names of the scholars we have involved. And no one had really done that with scholarship before. And because we're scholars and we believe in just having conversations and universal access to knowledge, we somewhat naively collaborated with them, and all of the scholars who collaborated with them signed non-disclosure agreements. So, can you or I certainly probably cannot get access to the manuscripts in the Green Scrolls collection. I'm sure you can see why. Now they have rationales for that. The reason why it really hampers research is so they gave these manuscripts to people to work on, the papyri they had acquired. Most of the people they gave them to had no experience with papyri at all, had never done anything like this. And one of the requirements of working on these papyri was that you involve undergraduates. No offense to any undergraduates in the room. Maybe your Greek is really outstanding, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to do this work because I'm not a specialist in papyrology and manuscripts. So they gave these texts to fairly unqualified people, and then they controlled whether or not they could publish them. I know of one graduate student who worked for several years as a graduate student on a fragment that was subsequently revealed to be unprovenanced. Meaning that now, given all of the scrutiny, they will never be able to publish it. Which if you're a graduate student and you just spent 2 years of your life working on a text, you just lost a lot of time. That's very damaging to their careers. So is it sustainable from an academic perspective? No. But they never really wanted us for our learning. The scholarly involvement in the message, the story, was to correct the grammar. You know, you couldn't say, for example, but I don't think there was a Jericho or a big battle there. That was not a thing that was going to make it into the museum. You could say, I think you're at the wrong location. But scholars weren't brought in to consult on the message, they were brought in to consult on the details.
So thank you very much. I haven't managed to get to the museum, although I've been very interested in it. But as you're talking, what I'm also thinking about is its context. So there on the wall, we have a number of museums. We have the Capitol at one end, we have Lincoln Memorial on the other. So the major secular pilgrimage that Americans do, if they still think about doing pilgrimages, is go to Washington to visit all of these monuments, which are used like sacred space in American secular culture. And then as you look at the way the museums have developed, in the year 2000, the Museum of the American Indian opened, and that has become like a pilgrimage and a ritual space for Native Americans. The Museum for African American Museum just opened, and I think that's going to serve that kind of role as well. So the question I would ask, and maybe somebody's already looking at this, is to what extent do you think that the originators here are thinking of this as a pilgrimage place? And I'm thinking of that also because what you're describing is a concentration of sacred objects. You know, some of them may be false reliquaries, but that's what you're describing. And do you have any sense that this is in their mind as well, that this will become a pilgrimage place, a sacred space, as well as an ideological space for them?
Yeah, well, first I'll say no one is more pro-vax than I am, so that would be just fine. I did ask them about pilgrimage. I asked them when they told me that they had gotten permission from the Vatican to use the artwork from the Sistine Chapel, and that they were going to have an exhibit from the Vatican, which at the time I thought would be just a lot better than it is. Because the Vatican exhibit is sort of very kind of like medieval, sort of into sort of the 19th century artwork of popes and things, which sort of makes it seem like there was no Catholic Church in the early period, which itself is quite revealing. But I thought, wow, they're going to have the Sistine Chapel replicated when you go in. And I said to them, wow, you're going to be the premier pilgrimage destination for Roman Catholics in America. You want to come and see the Vatican but can't afford to go to Rome. And they said, well, we certainly hope so. And that should be really, that does trouble me, because this is not a pro-Catholic museum by any stretch of the imagination. And when I asked them about curatorial oversight of the Vatican exhibit, they said, well, the Vatican curates it, but we will have some oversight because we can't let them do anything quote-unquote crazy. You know how we like to do that. So definitely they wanted to be a pilgrimage site for evangelicals. I'm sure they did really well at the March for Life, too. That would be a great time for them to open their doors. And they see themselves as very much collaborating with Catholics and Jews when it comes to sort of shared political social goals. That's where they see a lot of room for collaboration, and that's where they do well. So certainly they have thought pilgrimage, although I didn't ask them specifically about Protestants or Jews.
Thanks so much for your talk. I wanted to follow up on that theme. Do you think there's anything like this in the United States today? Or rephrasing that, what else is like this in particular ways? Whether it's you've mentioned the Creation Museum and things like that, but they're away from Washington, D.C. at the very least. There are many sites in Washington, as we just mentioned, that are sites of voyage, pilgrimage, exploration. There are attempts to influence legislators in many different ways. Where does this institution, I know it's brand new, it's just taking shape and it will take new forms over time, but where does this institution fit among other institutions in American culture with regard to religion and public life?
Well, it does, in many ways, it's like another Graceland, which is sort of a religious pilgrimage site, or dare I say Notre Dame, for Irish Catholics. So there are all kinds of sort of religious but not churches sites in the United States that I think it maps onto. Certainly it has a pilgrimage feel to it, much like going into a church night. What's a little different about it is that the people that effectively control this museum, and I know they say that they're separate, but any other museum in America, if the equivalent of Steve Green had been found guilty of trafficking in antiquities, he wouldn't have been there to cut the red tape on opening day, if they're really separate. So this person, this family, in fact, that is the face of this museum, not just the face of the museum, they have enormous political influence in Washington in ways that I think no other museum does. It's a museum that contains a kind of lobbying group because they are very powerful in their evangelical ways and because they put more money into this than anyone else.
Well, to follow up on Eric's question, as you were talking, I was reminded of the Templeton Foundation, which I think can be fairly described as beginning with a sectarian mode of gradually seeking greater respectability, but always tied to its roots. And so maybe there is a kind of model there that others would.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Templeton family. There's also, when we started, people would say, well, what about the robber barons? What about, the Vanderbilts? And I think they're probably more like William Colgate, Colgate toothpaste and the university. They're probably a little bit more like that in terms of how they think of what they're doing, but certainly in terms of the sort of tension between their roots and the quest for respectability, they greatly resemble the Templeton Foundation, but there's also a very kind of anti-elitist strain to them. Certainly, pouring academics into their organization, they've sort of raided the storehouses of intellectual knowledge for what they could get out of it, but they don't have any real commitment to that kind of engagement or work.
Thanks so much for making the trip and for your great thoughts and research. My name is Mara Willard, and I'm a member of the faculty at the University of Oklahoma, of all places, where this is local gossip, the story of the Green family. And one thing I'm interested in is how we as scholars or as practitioners think about pairing your work of critique with competing, with demonstrating that the world of the New Testament is actually fascinating once you realize these idiosyncrasies and once you put alongside these jarring end of the Gospel of Mark against the Gospel of John. And I thought as someone teaching Intro to Christianity at the University of Oklahoma, that I really couldn't compete with like a 12-minute video of someone having a revealed experience. And partly it's generational, it's entertainment, and partly the way we were perceived on campus is we're taking something away. Instead of adding knowledge, which perhaps in the Catholic traditions got a richer reputation, it felt in that evangelical, libertarian culture that I was trying to, in a power struggle with the Bible-centered students who were passionately invested in their narratives. What are your thoughts as a scholar trying to compete?
Yeah, it's tough. It's interesting to write about something like this, because the first time the people I'm writing about are alive. Presents their own set of challenges. One of the things that we wrote an article for Christian Century about this. We've tried to bring out the places where evangelicals themselves were kind of deceived. So one of the things that they've done is they acquired a lot of, you're not going to like this, funerary mosques from ancient Egypt, mummy mosques. Think Tutankhamun, but really ugly ones. Ugly not in that the person was ugly, just that the mummy mosque wasn't especially attractive. These are part of the funerary artwork, funerary ritual, and for a period of time that ends before the death of Jesus, mummy masks were papier-mâché, so they were kind of stuffed with manuscripts. Mostly like tax records and shopping lists and things like that. All scraps of papyri from Egypt. And Egypt is the best place to get papyri because of the soil. And so one thing that Museum of the Bible did, and Scott Carroll in particular did, was melt them down. There are all of these social media posts I have of Scott Carroll being like he's watching football on a Sunday afternoon, he'll melt down some mummy mask while it's happening. So you melt them down in the quest for Bible text. And there are a couple of prominent evangelical figures, Scott Carroll, Josh McDowell, evangelical minister, who does this in this very theatrical way. You pay your money to come to the conference to watch Josh McDowell dissolve a mummy mask and discover, hidden from view, protected by God, a fragment of the New Testament. And it's always the earliest. They're never like, I think this might be the second earliest. It's always the earliest. It's sort of like they brought the archaeology to you and the mystery of the discovery of these texts to you. The strange thing is, no one's ever found a New Testament text in a mummy mask, because if we were to ask anyone who specializes in this, they stopped doing that around the time of the reign of the Emperor Augustus. So they're destroying these Egyptian artifacts that have cultural value in Egypt as this sort of like purposeless like pageant in order to discover the little texts that were never in them. And it is not in the best interest of Christianity to lie like that. Because then when you realize that in fact you didn't see what you thought you saw, that undermines anyone's call to spread the message. And so those kinds of things, what we try to emphasize there was, you're being misled unnecessarily. There's no reason to tell people that. Someone has fed you information, giving you something that you never had. So I try to kind of emphasize those ways, the ways in which the message is not beneficial to people who are believers in it. I try to emphasize that. But it's tough because, you know, whether it's the kind of fundamentalism you might see in kind of the Green Project, or the kind of fundamentalism you might see in sort of some of Bart Ehrman's popular works, which is also has its own kind of sort of appeal, and like, I'm telling you the secret, and now here you are. That's just less appealing than, well, I'm not really sure. But here's some confusing texts and some ways of thinking about it, and it's getting really quite nuanced now. Wouldn't you prefer what you started with? Like, I realize what's not as appealing, but you know, I just have the advantage of being true. Whatever that's worth.
Candidate, I have a question. When I finished the book, I thought your account of the Bible Museum itself was kind of fun. Like, I love to go to these kinds of event spaces on the way to see your friend at Vanderbilt. I went to Dollyland, which of course is a theme park devoted to Dolly Parton, and it was wonderful. It was campy, and there was all these quotes everywhere. The higher the hair, the closer to God. And it was kind of fun. That didn't disturb me so much. What disturbed me so much as a scholar is maybe something that perhaps the undergraduates don't understand. It was the non-disclosure path. Because the essence of scholarship, the essence of what we do, is you discover something and you share it. That's the whole point of doing it. So you publish it, you put it on the internet, you publish it in a journal, you present it at a conference, and you have lots of scholars who are exactly in your area commenting on it. And it's in that give and take. So the idea that you would actually have scholars agreeing to be part of something, and they were so desirous of being part of it that they would sign a non-disclosure pact. Did you ask any of those scholars if they understood what they were doing? Because it seems to me that cuts at the very heart of what places like Boston College are about, which is we share our knowledge to undergraduates, to doctoral students, to our fellow professors.
Yeah, they did manage to quite effectively privatize the academy in this way. And really, they brought their corporate business models to my field. Yeah, I did ask them what they were thinking. And said, oh, we were told it was standard. Have you never seen a standard? Maybe, like, if you make it, I would hate to say that there were financial motivations here. But yes, we're supposed to be about sharing knowledge, and I have this very naive idea that we're supposed to be all in this together, and if my ideas are wrong, hopefully my wrong idea, say, the jading of the martyrdom of Polycarp, will help someone else formulate the correct idea in a better way, right? And that's the purpose of what we're all trying. We're supposed to all be in it together. And so yes, this seems just highly, highly unusual. And then there's one thing that's disappointed me in terms of the response since all of this has come out. It has been, I rather wish that my colleagues who were involved with them would stop working for them.
Jan?
Thanks. So you discussed the problem of discussing evidence or presenting evidence that isn't actually there, dissolving a mummy mask and then producing a text that was never composed when the mummy masks were in use, as it was from the pack. But another problem with these unprovenance artifacts and their presentation is that they've been procured at a time of tremendous violence and upheaval in Iraq and in Syria. And I wonder, to what degree does the possibility that these have been sourced from ISIS, for example, come up? And to what extent is that avoided in doing this procurement process?
Yeah, so when we wrote our first 2 articles for the Daily Beast and the Atlantic, for a while hashtag Hobby Lobby ISIS was trending on Twitter. And I was both really proud and also slightly horrified because they didn't procure them after the rise of ISIS, but they did procure them during the reign of Al-Qaeda. And what I would say about the market is it's actually not about the things you've already bought. It's about when you purchase an unprovenanced artifact, you are building a black market. You are contributing to that. And contributing to the black market does lead to the rise of ISIS. They were procured in moments of enormous violence. And while here, the crime is fraud, once you go back in the chain, you're talking about great violence. Not just the looting and the destruction of objects and the loss of heritage, but loss of life. Real loss of life. There are scholars who would say, well, if we have them and they're authentic, we should publish them, we're protecting the knowledge. There's an argument in the Federalist that it was better to have these artifacts here and safe from ISIS than to have them there where they were vulnerable. And that argument has been used for a long time, for over 100 years. It's better to have all of these beautiful marble sculptures in the British Museum than to leave them where we found them, where you know what the locals are like. It's deeply colonialistic and racist. And also it's just not true. If you think of the museums in Berlin destroyed in the bombing there, if you think of even the Great Fire of Chicago, which destroyed a lot of papers relating to Joseph Smith, you know that actually not everything is safe here. I know we think that we're really civilized, but not everything is safe. Moreover, mummy masks aren't safe at all. So it's really only the things that we value that will be safe here. So I think there's great violence, but I'm not really persuaded by the, well, we should publish what we have and things are safer here arguments either.
Please join me in thanking Canada.